Let me start then and say welcome to the Cosmos Café, which is the brainstorm of Marco Morelli, a friend of mine here in Colorado, who unfortunately had prior commitments, so he can't be here. I am the author of the book, Election 2016, The Great Divide, The Great Debate. Michael, you can hold up the book, sure. and I don't have to. We're going to be talking about the chapter titled Anger in the Road to Hell. But first, I'd like to just speak briefly about how to read the book. It's available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Ex Libris. It's available in three formats: what we call the trade paper in the trade, and the hardback edition, which you get extra pictures and a little more information about me and the book. And then it's also available the ebook. And my recommendation is you purchase all three for reasons, not just to enrich myself, but for the enrichment of the experience of the reading. I have here on this ancient iPad the book in e format. You can read it via your phone, and there's this technology called reflowable, which means the content is formatted to fit the device you're reading it on. Be it, it's different on if I read it on this, which is an older MacBook Air. It's different if I read it on this iPad. It's different if I read it on my phone. The nice thing about the ebook is there are a lot of hyperlinks in the text. And you can just click on the hyperlink and it'll take you to the reference that I'm referring to. If you read it as a paper book, you'd have to have your computer there and then manually type in the hyperlink if you wanted to do that. So and the paper book, I have a couple people who have given me some feedback on reading it, and they write in the margins and they highlight. And are you doing that already? Oh my goodness. Yeah, so you can, the trade paper is great for that. The ebook is great for the connection to the hyperlinks, but the ebook doesn't have the index because every format is different. Like the chapter we're going to talk about is on my MacBook Air is page 266. On my iPad, it's page 137. In the paper books, it's page 132. So you can't have an index with a reflowable format. so far. Maybe somebody will come up with a way that they can figure that out. So the next thing I want to talk about before we get into the subject matter is the structure of the book. I wrote it in real time, the first draft, and the process took about 3.5 years, which was not my intention. The structure of the book is each chapter has a date below the title, the headline, and the date signifies what was going on in the world at the time that I reacted to what was going on in the world. And the chapter we're going to talk about is May 23rd, 2016. And so the process was I was reacting to the election, and the election in the first chapter of the book is June 16th, 2016, which is the time that Trump announced his candidacy. The last chapter of the book is 6 months into his presidency, when it was also the service for my father's death. So the book covers that time period. Each chapter is relevant to what was going on in the world, the campaigns at that particular time. And yet, the first chapter actually starts about 50,000 years ago. And so it moved, the text, the subject matter moves around in historical frame. It talks about much more than just the election, but the election is the focal point. And this particular chapter was spawned by a visit I had from an old friend. And we were watching it was May 23rd, I think it is, May 23rd, 2016. So we're watching the NBA basketball finals. We're paying attention to the election, because I've known him for over 50 years. I go into some biography about his and I relationship, his and I relationship that goes back to when we were teenagers. And he's written a memoir a number of years ago, and I reviewed his memoir. And he's a very angry person, which anger is a theme throughout the book, because there's a lot of anger today, and it's magnified, amplified by this medium, social network, Twitter, Facebook. So I think that ties into the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So all of this worked together as I wrote this, and it's a brief chapter. It's only a couple pages, but it hits on a lot of subjects, which the whole book does. I introduce themes, and then the themes are carried throughout the book, and they layer one upon the other. And it begins with sort of the beginnings of mankind, modern man, and ends with the death of a very important man in my life. And it uses the election as the framework for all these philosophical discussions. And one thing I need to say before I open it up is that this conversation we're going to have about anger, I don't want anyone to think that it's a substitute for therapy. I'm not practicing therapist. I'm a writer, an author. I write fiction and nonfiction now. Our conversations here in the Cosmos Café get very deep, and they're very emotive sometimes. But if this conversation, which will be available to anyone with access to the internet, I want to encourage anyone to if it triggers something, to seek professional consultation. This is not a substitute for that. This is, for now, it's 4 guys with beards talking about anger and how the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I can stop now, or I can continue. No.
Well, how do you want to open it up, Mark? How do I engage you?
Well,
I was thinking you're on a roll. Why don't you just take it the next step too, and then
that's fair too.
okay, like I said, go ahead. Go ahead, Ed. No?
No, I said as you wish. Whatever feels best for you, let's go with it.
I guess the heart of the chapter is an incident that happened. I think the incident happened May 20th. And it was, the chapter had the visit from my friend, an angry person who was a Bernie Sanders supporter, still is. He's still posting rants on Facebook, and they've ratcheted up. He's gotten more and more angry. And also, at that time, President Obama gave a speech which I reference. He declared the bison, the American bison, as the national animal. And at that very time, there was an incident in Yellowstone National Park where the wildlife service, the rangers, had to kill a bison calf because tourists had intervened trying to save the animal, which they thought was in distress, that it had been abandoned by its mother, by the herd. And so they went in there, they picked up the animal, and they called the, you know, they got their little cell phones, they called the Forest Service. Oh, we have this animal. So I linked an article written by a wildlife biologist who tried to explain to the Twittersphere, here's another sphere we have to worry about, which is very potent. And people just got so angry on both sides of the issue. So this professional wildlife biologist wanted to, okay, here's what's really going on in the natural world. You don't want to you don't want to, you know, your heart may be in the right place, but you're really screwing things up, which is the road to hell, paved with good intentions. So that's linked, and if you have the ebook, you can just click on the, Doug linked it to the forum. Is that what we call this? The written part of the Café. So all these things that were happening in real time converged, which sparked me to write this brief chapter about anger and the road to hell. And I came to the conclusion that the article is a very good, or the incident is a very good metaphor for the current world we find ourselves in. And that world is chaotic and hostile, and that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I define what hell is, because I think that's necessary, that everybody understands what we're talking about. And finally, that in general, people are ill-educated, and that we don't understand the world we live in. And so I'm going to stop there. And I did ask some questions about, personally, about anger and the road to hell. If anybody would want to answer or kick off a conversation with personal anecdotes or thoughts on either of those two topics.
I'm going to kick off on the topic of anger, because I think it's a very relevant one in this time. And I'm going to speak from personal experience without intending it to be the end all be all, because everybody has a different experience with that emotion and that energy inside their bodies. Is that, well, first of all, I have to start from a very dark place. I learned how powerful anger was when I turned it inward, because I was mad, I was depressed, I was sad, I wasn't getting my fucking way. As Mark, I think that's a good point. We have to be aware of how, when we don't get our way, how anger comes up. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if we're educated of what to do with the anger. Because I think anger is very useful to speak about grievances. But the way we relate to it, Mark, I agree. We're not educated. We don't have a broad base of understanding. I've studied biologically some of the ways that we can understand that there's emotional intelligence. I don't know what to say, in the sense it helps tells us something's going on in the environment we need to pay attention to. And I took anger to a very dark place because I was cut off from my child. I was cut off from my wife. I felt like I wasn't doing enough. There's a lot of background that God bless my parents, but they did the best parenting, but they were damaged, wounded people. And that affected me. And I took it to the point, I found it interesting. I took it to the point at 46, 8 years before Wallace, to hang myself. But the thing is I failed miserably. For some reason, I failed miserably. It's the only failure that I will say I'm very proud of, you know. But what it taught me, with the anger turned inwards and not having an understanding that I needed to find my way. I needed to find a way to channel, as Martin Luther King and Gandhi does, to channel it and express it in as much of a non-violent way as possible, short of, especially physical violence. Verbal, come on, you know, I can hurt your feelings, but that doesn't mean I've harmed you, you know, in my expression of my anger. I can go to the extent, like I tell people, anger is a way to say no that evolution has told us, but how do we say no? Am I going to vomit on somebody, especially if in the context it's my child? No, I'm going to tell no to my child, but I'm going to say fuck no to a mugger. You know, two different ways, but the understanding how we keep it in context and channel that energy. Mark, you're 100%. We're not educated. And I've been practicing this and trying to educate people to have a more educated relationship, especially with that emotion, because it's about injustice. Now that can be misperceived, don't get me wrong, but it also is it doesn't mean that it at times it's very relevant to the situation. And you gave an example of your friend, and to me that's an example of somebody that doesn't totally understand how to use their anger, even if he is a Bernie Sanders fan. I don't care. The way you use it to promote your own point of view is, to me, because of my experience of what I did to myself and knowing that I could have very well used that same power to hurt somebody else. And I'm so fucking glad that I did, because I don't want that responsibility of letting my anger get out of control. I'm not trying to use my tears for therapy. And trying to talk about it, it brought up some stuff that the pain, like you point out, Mark, how are we going to relate to the pain that comes with being part of evolution, you know, and trying to expand or whatever our feelings, our notions of what is real. Because I personally have honored the fact a lot of times I'm uncertain what is real. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Real is whatever I think it is at the time. So that's how I handle it. I just it's a very easy way to go. I'm not one of these folks that has to challenge himself all the time. It's just, okay, well, it's real to me, and we'll deal with that. It could be that later on, that's something that you pointed out, Michael, that it's not quite the way we perceived it originally, and we have to, you know, adjust our perceptions and what we think about it. We have to do a lot of whatever it is that we all do all the time, but I think that's all part of what we have to do. What I appreciate, and Mark brought this up in his introduction, is that in a very straightforward way, you are able to make clear, it's kind of like practicing what you preach, how multi-layered most of these topics that we tend to look at very monolithically and very simplistically, that they're actually much more nuanced, and there's much more involved than originally meets the eye. And by taking an event, I'll just use the chapter on anger as the example, I have a longtime friend whom I don't necessarily agree with on all things, but we're still friends. And there's an incident that occurs out in Yellowstone Park that is tangentially related to something that the President of the United States does, and they all kind of focus on the same basic issues. Or if that's not the real reason for their existence, they can be seen in that way. I can perceive them as such, and that to me is another layer of complexity that comes into this whole discussion that we have, and like the ones we have here on the Café, because we like to think the world is relatively simple that we find ourselves in, and I tend to make mine simple where I can, but I'm very aware, just like I said at the beginning, that that's what I'm doing. I try to simplify it so that I can keep it manageable. Otherwise, a lot of times it would just overwhelm me. And I don't like the feeling of being overwhelmed. And so that's the tactic that I take in order to do that. So I always look for, well, what's the essence, or what's at the bottom of it, and what's really important and what's not important. And when I think I have something that's important, I have to sometimes go off by myself and figure out, well, why do I think that's important? Why isn't it what the other person or one of the other people that was in the discussion or in the confrontation or the whatever it is that we were having at the time played into that. So I really appreciate the fact that and this is what you seem to be able to do very well in your book, is to highlight the complexity without making it complex. It gives you things that you can like hold on to and talk about. You can get yourself confused and all wrapped up and around the axle before it's all over. That's the one thing about the article from the wildlife biologist. That your intention's good, but yeah, you're just being stupid, or you're ignorant, or you're uninformed, or and none of those need to be an insult. I certainly don't know everything. You don't know everything, so I have to go on the assumption there's lots of stuff I have no idea about. And so my reaction might have been, if I'm out there, well, I have no idea what to do because I'm as lost in the wilds of Yellowstone as I am most of the time in my study in Hauneck in Germany. So, okay, then I'm not going to pick it up and take it somewhere. I do not know that much about wildlife. I was a Boy Scout, and we got a whole different indication of how do you relate to nature, or what's nature about, and actually a reverence and an honor for nature that a lot of people don't get because they didn't have those kinds of experiences. So I have a little bit that I can fall back on in cases like that. But I think what's interesting is that it does touch on things, and it's like you said, anger is a theme that it goes through here. It's in the preface. It's like foreshadowed. It's in the text here, and your friend is, and I don't really know, and I have trouble understanding why so many people are so angry on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's an aspect to the anger that you talk about that is, I don't want to say exclusively, but it's exceedingly American. There's lots of things Americans get so wrapped up about that are, for most of the people, like I live in a rural community, most people around here are non-issues. A lot of folks I talk to would just go, well, why would you get upset about that? and these are things that a lot of Americans that I know, because I'm on Facebook about once every 2 weeks, and rue the day that I opened it up again, because I was like, oh shit, and I got it's a real chore to go through, just scroll through my news feed to find out, basically at my point in life, if any of my friends have died, or something, because that's some of the contact that or the only contact that I have with some of them. So they're still posting. I guess they're still kicking. All right, but I don't really. It's hard for me to grasp what that is and why. And it apparently, and this is another thing I think you highlight through the recurring theme. It sitting really deep. Now, this isn't a superficial phenomenon. This is really down inside what you say in the American psyche, and that is to me an interesting subject. You know, what does that mean? What constitutes a national psyche? When, you know, you brought up so many things. So when I was going through taking notes, I had to stop, because it was like, well, these are all topics we could talk about, but well, we may not get through the first one, let alone the next 350 I noted, you know, that came up, because it does, once you do start thinking about it, it does start unpacking a lot of these things that contribute to the complexity that aren't directly related to the complexity. And it makes it in that, you know, challenging, but rewarding at the same time. So you know, in that regard, I think you did an excellent job of stirring the pot, I guess is the simplest way to say it.
Thank you.
And which is not a bad thing to do. You know, sometimes we just have to stir the pot.
Yeah.
Now, what people do with that stirring, and whether they're tasting the soup along, that's a whole different story. But at least you get it a little stirred. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciated stirring the pot, but man, I had to leave the kitchen for a while. Man, it got anger has a heat to it, and I was feeling it off the words, you know.
Well, that's why I learned a long time ago: always wear an apron in the kitchen.
Yeah, right, right. Well, and I just want to go back.
People know what I've been cooking.
Yeah, I just want to go back, maybe touch in and Mark quotes some interest, you know, not necessarily the same, but we have overlap of the biology of anger, and it tends to have a type of survival, you know, place. And this is what I appreciate about Mark, even though I kind of have some other points of view along the biological line, that I think part of and I'm going to make a vast generalization, part of Americans' problem with anger has been from the get-go, because they've been angry since they landed on this cotton-picking land, because the king was telling them what the fuck to do, and that's based on Mark's notion of kingship and power. And so we've had a long history of anger, of trying to make our place in this new land with these strange people that we decided, oh, well, you know, you're less than us, which I don't agree with, but you know, it's set in motion a lot of, because one of the things anger comes online for biologically is when you're frustrated, or there's a slight anxiety about encountering somebody that's different than you. And it begins in the family, because a lot of my anger and the way I had to change it began with, in my family, not only my mom practicing passive aggressive anger, but my dad, because he was diagnosed with, at the time the term was manic depression instead of bipolar, and he had these episodes, and I had to learn to endure them until I left and went in the military and became a hippie, one of Mark's, you know, famous pokes at. But as I grew older and I had my own child, and that was a significant moment, I at least set my intention that some things that happened with my father, and before I had my child, I had enough understanding that what was going on in his brain, in some ways he didn't have control. He had a chemical disruption, or whatever you want to call it. Still didn't take away the hurt and the pain that happened out of that, but it gave me this neat evolutionary perspective to step back and look, and at least have a sense that, okay, I need more space to look at my father, not just as my role model, but as a human being that has his own pain and suffering. And out of that, he tended to project it on me. And when I had my child, especially Jeffrey, I set an intention. There's some things I don't want to repeat. I think we have an evolutionary capacity to learn from experience. We're just from my point of view, we don't have a large percentage of people that have the same outlook as all of us have is that there is a capacity, from my point of view, to learn from experience and not necessarily repeat it in a habitual way, if I can say it that way. There may be repetition, but not habitual. And the less you break that habitualness, or the more you break that habitualness, it kind of just doesn't happen as often. And when it does, in my experience, I have a resilience of how to, oops, cut that real quick. My radar is real fast. Mike, don't go there. My intentions. And just as an example of this, and it has to do with the power of anger. It's a concrete example that just happened to me recently when I was at a bus stop waiting for a bus, and there's a few people around, and there's this one individual that I assessed that he was having a very spinning moment, and he definitely was acting out of a trauma activation I could feel, and he was spouting words of God, and he was talking to this one gentleman, and this one gentleman had a Bible. He even approached him and goes, "I see you're a Christian," and he just went right after that guy because he had a Bible. And he interrupted a conversation he had. And I sat there, breathing, feeling that what was being exchanged for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then I got up because of something he said, because he was trying to tell this other inner gentleman, trying to project his pain onto this gentleman and everybody around him. And I could feel for it, but I'm going, this is enough. And because he said, "Why are you cut off? Why are you cut off? Feel the air, open up." And he was doing it in a violent, aggressive way. And I just got up and I said, "Sir, you need to be quiet. These people are trying to wait for a bus. Be quiet. That's enough." And he goes, "Well, freedom of speech." I said, "I'm exercising my freedom of speech too. You need to be quiet. You are projecting pain on everybody. You need to be quiet." And interestingly, he went around the person he was projecting. He hid behind him, and he moved over, picked up his stuff, and that was by me. He goes, "May Jesus bless you." And I just looked at it. In the meantime, the gentleman and a few people said, "Thank you." To me, that is a smart way of using anger, but I didn't get there overnight. That's a smart way to use your power, but I didn't get there overnight. My darkest hour of trying to learn how to use my anger was when I tried to hang myself, because I internalized the pain, and that became a power. And that I wasn't really trying to, and now that I think, I wasn't trying to necessarily kill myself. I wanted to kill the pain. But in that distorted point of view, that means I wasn't thinking about necessarily, the consequences of ending my life in a clear way. The only clarity was, if I do this, I won't have any more pain. That was the only clarity. And it's a delusional form of clarity in my book, from my experience.
I think in the bus stop situation, it wasn't necessarily a form of, I guess it's a form of anger, but and it's seeking justice. But the difference between, say, what Mark is talking about and what you demonstrated there is justice for the situation at hand, for everyone involved, to be at peace, to not necessarily settle the score or anything like that. It was just simply, in this situation, this is what we deal with. But what we are dealing with, there's social justice warriors, there's anyone seeking individual justice, and I partly view it as a good thing that we can express certain feelings online. But it has reached a point where it's been taken offline too many times. There's a certain aspect of justice that can be achieved for the self online, or the amount of anger you can express. And like we talked about in the communication discussion, like you can air out whatever online, but obviously that's not enough for people to be heard. This is a political fight in a lot of ways, this anger. So it's been taken to the streets. My turnaround moment was, I guess, in Charlottesville, when the individual was killed by, I don't have to go into the story, but essentially there was the protesting going on by the neo-Nazis and then the anti-protesters against their protesting. And in my mind, that's when there should have been a line drawn. It was a protest against the removal of certain Confederate statues, I believe. And the neo-Nazis, though perhaps 99 or more % of the world can agree that these individuals are clearly in the wrong or wrong-headed, or their idea of justice is completely skewed, to project into that situation with that was a safe space for them to protest, to have a freedom of speech. And I gave examples in Germany where you can just step away from that. You can, they in Germany, during a certain march, they'll have a charity donate to, at least in this example, a charity donated money towards anti-neo-Nazi, like to help people get out of families that were, or the mindset of neo-Nazism. So every mile or kilometer that the neo-Nazis would march, there would be signs saying, "Congratulations, you just contributed $10,000 to our fund." But nobody showed up. Nobody was there other than a little bit of media that would naturally appear during something like that. So that's what Ed's talking about with in Europe or Germany. Yeah, they've gone through a lot of trauma with the world wars, and now they're here in this present moment and saying, well, we see these guys are idiots, but we're not going to give them the time of day. In America, everyone sees each other as the idiot, and there's anger towards the idiot who just doesn't get it. At least in my mind, that's my line of thinking right now. So if you take one side, you're going to be angry at the other side for not getting your point of view. And it's expounded with social media. But I think partly what you're getting at, Mark, is that anger, it's being channeled in all these different movements. And we sort of touched on the evolutionary aspect that I noted the quote that we took from last week's conversation, in which we're born with a psychological constitution, which is marked by error, I guess, in which our evolutionary paths doesn't match with our ability to think past the evolution. So the Me Too movement is saying, well, yeah, there might be biologically the alpha male and the domination over the younger or the less strong or the female. But the Me Too movement says, well, in my mind, this is allowing females to have the voice, and they have the media power or the social media to attempt to find an equal playing ground. Then it's taken beyond that to where it's not just equality, it's take down the man or make sure everybody goes to jail that has a sexual thought or something like that, along with the 95,000 other movements going on. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but there's this anger involved everywhere you turn, and it's expounded by the media, of course. There's hundreds of people talking about that, but I'm interested in the article you posted on concept creep, is that what it's called? Where the concept of bullying, the concept of trauma, the concept of various other negative emotions or connotations or concepts have kind of creeped into its own formation, and it's away from the source. So that, I don't know if you're saying or if the article is saying that anger is a secondary emotion, which may be a step away from, I don't know, anxiety or fear of the other, as Michael was saying. Maybe you can explain that a little bit more.
Okay, I will try. So many good concepts and ideas brought up here. Where shall I start? Anger is a secondary emotion. And Michael, I saw you shaking your head, but you actually reinforce the idea that it's a secondary emotion, in that what triggered it is a defense of hurt. Injustice is the primary emotion, pain. And anger is a response to deal with it. And it targets, it energizes you, it gives you strength and to attack that which is hurting you. So in that, there's always something below the anger, and that's usually hurt.
Or caring about something.
Well, yeah. So you're hurt because people aren't caring about what you care about. So that inflicts pain on you, either psychological, emotional, or physical, to the point of concept creep. The point of that is there has been via the universities and I call them the thought leaders, they've expanded, the guys pointing the paper, they've expanded the definitions of these trauma, bullying, whatever, to make it, and that riles up. If you think you've been bullied or traumatized or whatever, you're going to get angry. And so that again is the road to hell. The intentions of the people who are saying, oh, you're a victim, they're good. That's the social justice part of it. But the actual effect is to make things worse, because if you think you are a victim, then you're going to get angry and you're going to look for a perpetrator where there may previously have it'd just be like back in the day, and I think Ed, you'll remember this, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That was kind of the credo. And now it's, oh my God, words can really hurt you.
Yeah, we've gone from one extreme to another.
And if you believe that, it will in fact hurt you. And then you're going to look for retribution. And so people just get further and further apart. And the anger just bubbles more and more. And this is, I talk about it a couple times on how if something is not acknowledged and expressed and dealt with, it builds up pressure, and sooner or later that pressure is going to release. And that was the metaphor with Old Faithful, in that people now via social media and there's all sorts of evolutionary reasons for human emotion being the way it was. But most of our history are humans. We were hunter-gatherers in small bands, in small tribes. So we we knew everybody, and there was consequence for all behavior, and everybody knew everybody. There wasn't a world outside of the territory and the group. And I wanted to link a paper by David Buss about happiness, and I wasn't able to for some reason. And his point is that because we're in such, and I think it was Ed was talking about overwhelming. You get, with so much stimuli now, you get overwhelmed. That's not a good feeling. So Ed's come up with a good solution. He doesn't pay attention to it. He doesn't go on Facebook. I bet you're not on Twitter. and because that just fuel that. What's that?
I closed my account.
I quit after the election, and I was finished with the first draft of this book. I closed my Twitter account because it was just fueling all this nonsense, and my account was hacked, and I changed my password. I mean, it's just gotten. But a lot of people, because we are evolutionarily, our biology is we focus more on the negative than the positive, because that's a threat to our existence. So the more negativity there is, the more anger, it just fuels it, because that's what we focus on. And it's almost impossible now, and here we go again, the road to hell. When people came, the Facebook was updating. He invented it to try and, it was hot or not. It was it was a dating thing, like trying to find a girl or a guy at Harvard. And Twitter was also invented for positive, so your friends could, I'm at the movie theater, come join me. That was a motivation for Twitter. And now these things have just exploded into ways to make enormous amounts of money, but what they've done is just fuel anger and hostility. And so we have this, we're in this, I can't call it a brave new world. We're in territory that is crazy making, really crazy making.
It's just so complex to even attempt to even talk about it. Like, we could focus on anger the whole time here. There's also positive psychology that was what just started in the 90s. I guess Maslow originally kind of mentioned something about positive there needs to be more of a focus on the positive side rather than the negative side of therapy. And now there's a whole wing of psychology that's devoted to the positive feelings and viewing from a different perspective. But then that's just making matters more complex and perhaps getting further away from the roots, who knows? But yeah, it's definitely complex.
Yeah,
that's what I would term it.
I just watched a podcast with a psychologist, a PhD, and that's her focus. That's what her PhD is on, positive psychology. Martin Seligman, he was a little after Maslow. He's still alive, I believe. Kind of coined the term positive psychology. But that's not of our nature, because we evolved in a hostile environment, chaotic, threatening, and we still have all our emotional, my point of view, all our emotions are rooted in survival, and survival in a hostile world.
I take your point that all of our capacities are rooted in survival, but I think we're at an evolutionary intersection of really expanding what is that survival. We also have within our brain, biologically, our ability to heal, to correct, and not buy into negative bias, and that it has to be learned. I agree. You kind of have to go counter to instinct without negating instinct. That and one of the reasons I shake my head of anger, I take your point academically, it's a secondary emotion, but I have to deal with the emotion I'm feeling in the present, and that's fucking anger. And once I deal with that, you know, that it just, for me, using my conceptual capacity in a more harmonious way with the reality of my instincts. Because what I learned, Mark, is to help me heal, the power of how my language in my head shaped my responses became really, really important. And so it probably goes to your point of how these concepts can twist and distort paying attention to what is really going on, you know, and use concepts not to avoid direct experience per se, but to help, okay, how do I stand up, you know, or how do, in my case, because of my physicality and being a wrestler, how do I move to avoid, you know, if I don't learn these certain strategies, and I had to learn them with my conceptual and interacting with somebody. It wasn't just all, it was doing, but the doing included somebody walking me through and talking to me. And one of the things that helped me is taking ownership of my own self-talk and how I relate to that negative bias that comes up. Like I've said in a past, I think I said it in a past thing, is that one of the gifts I take out of my trauma is I got another chance to relate to my defensive system, my instinct system, that is very valuable. And you're right, we're born with it. But I got a chance to relate to it and strip away all the things I've been told of what I'm supposed to do with it, and try to try to see how can I defend myself but not be blindly a victim of my defense mechanism. That's natural. It's natural. But just because it's natural doesn't mean I can't learn how to use it in wiser ways. And I think your book, it hit home, and I've been wrestling with it, and I wrestled with your language and back and forth and stuff. But I'm on board with Ed. I had to kind of just get used to the flat out, this is the way it is, this is your point of view. I had to get used to that because I was paying attention to how your words affected me, so that I could go deeper in understanding where you were going. And I may not come to the same conclusions, but it was a good exercise to watch myself work with your point of view in a very good way, like we're trying to do today.
If I can build on that, you actually made a very good case, Michael, for, you know, primary and secondary emotions don't have anything to do with the essentiality of it. It's simply chronological. This comes first, not followed. So primary is the first and secondary is the second, but it's not of less value. It's what do you do with it? So you said yourself, it was the pain, and the pain is not anger.
Mm-hmm.
You were angry at the pain. That's
exactly
the point that Mark's trying to make.
Yes,
because and that's just one way to describe it. So
yeah,
so it's secondary, but it doesn't make it less in any way.
Yeah,
and I think one of the issues I have with a predominantly biological understanding of evolution, it's there. There's no doubt about it. I agree with Mark 100%. Our fundamental reaction is always to the threat, not We're really happy when things go well, but we're always looking for it and what's going to go wrong with it. Okay,
Exactly.
we do that.
Exactly.
It's all I have no problem with that whatsoever. However, and this is why I like Gapes so much. He said, along with that, we spent most of our time as hunter-gatherers. We were in what he would call archaic and magical consciousness. Tens of thousands of years. Actually, if you want to, depending on where you decide the humanity as human beings started, it can go back hundreds of thousands of years, which is my personal preference, that it's even longer than that. We were in this magical mythical is relatively new, 10,000 years maybe? Okay. Maybe. And the one that's really driving us these days, what he calls mental rational, is exactly the root of our problem. And biological evolution doesn't help us understand what's gone on in our hearts and heads. And that and there is a disconnect between them. They're rooted in this physicality. But the world that they have to deal with is a much different one. And that's why I think, you know, an American, it's bad here, believe me. Germans are as irrational as you can get. But it's particularly obvious in America that it's either this or that. There's only two choices. There's never the gray. The world's gray, and there's never gray. It's always black and white. It's always you're with me or you're against me. That's how political debates get framed. That's how. And if you don't agree with what I'm saying, you obviously support the other. If you are against Trump, you're obviously a Clinton supporter. Why? Where's the logical conclusion that the one leads to the other? But in most people's minds that I encounter, this seems to be the dominant way of going about it. It's an either or. There's an absolutivity that's involved in all of this. And this absolutivity is actually what's getting in the way.
I think
when
so.
You can overcome it. This is the example that Doug had brought up. There was, believe me, anytime Nazis show up anywhere here in Germany, there'll be 100 of them for a demonstration, and there are 1,000 to 10,000 other people who are demonstrating around them. Mundane as the press may like to think. However, every once in a while, and this is what I love, in one of these instances, the anti-demonstrators turned it into a charity event to collect money to oppose Nazism. And the Nazis, by their actions, it was a very creative way of doing it, by their actions, were raising money for those who were going to oppose them. And so they stopped demonstrating. It's an extremely effective, non-violent way. It's a beauty to behold when you realize the irony that's in there, and that irony that we're capable of and allows us to do things needs to be employed more often. But too often, you know, we get caught up in this either or thing. You know, it's either this way or that. Well, no, it's not. It could be different. And as much as I like to simplify things, I've also been accused more than once of overcomplicating matters because I bring in things that apparently have nothing to do with it. Well, yeah, but when you start addressing the complexity of an issue, it starts getting complicated. You know, sometimes you have to slow down and back off. But and this is the point I actually want to get to. What's missing more and more here, and definitely in the United States, is a culture of discussion, not debate, discussion. That you can actually talk to someone. You know, the thing I appreciate about your chapter on anger was you and your friend spent a lot of time yelling at each other and drinking a lot of beer, but you weren't in fisticuffs and nobody got thrown out. So you are engaging one another, regardless of whether it leads anywhere or doesn't lead, but at least you're doing that. And all the time that you spend engaging another, for whatever reason, is time that all who are involved have as an opportunity for something positive to result from it, whatever that might be. I'm not a real big fan of the power of positive thinking. And I'm not the kind of person that says, oh, if I sit here and say, I'll be happy today, I'll be happy today, I'll be happy today. You know, chances are good, not after the 10th time I said I'm happy, I'll be so pissed off and I'm saying something stupid that I'll get mad at myself. You know, that kind of. So it's like you kind of have to take it as it comes. But this whole, I mentioned this in the last time when I was at the boarding school here, we would have conferences where literally people were pounding on tables and storming out and slamming doors and yelling and screaming. And that night we're all sitting around having a beer at somebody's birthday party because, well, that's what you do there. And you simply, I remember that used to love watching debates in German parliament. The first time I was in Germany, because there was yelling and screaming. People were wadding up paper and throwing it at the person that was talking in the front. It was just like this total mayhem. It had absolutely nothing to do with quote unquote civilized political debate like you see in the House of Commons in Great Britain, where people get up and here and this and the other people in the back and they go, yes, yes, yes. It's nothing like that. This was really just, it was short. It wasn't like in the Spanish Parliament where they actually do have a brawl. It was short of that, but it was not the things you see on C-SPAN where everybody gets up at a podium and talks to an empty room for most things because nobody's listening. And I think that's the point that I want to get to is how many people are actually willing to listen anymore? Why is it that we have this unwillingness to listen? You know, am I going to fall apart, be overwhelmed, be denied, be persecuted because I listened to what you had to say? And I was raised in you didn't always listen to everybody else kind of environment. My parents were, you know, on a coal mining town, Western Pennsylvania. There wasn't a lot of thought going on anywhere for anything. I was kind of the outlier because I like to think about stuff. You know, it's like, well, that's not going to get you anywhere. You can think about it all day, but it doesn't mean anything, kind of thing. But being able to listen to others, you know, most of my friends, people that I actually call friends these days, don't agree with me on practically anything. We have different views about the most fundamental things of life, and that's why we're friends, because we can actually talk with one another because nobody's trying to prove to the other one that you have to see the world the way I do. We share something that's other than that. There's a bond between us. They're not family, but there's a bond. Maybe they're clannish. Maybe we're clannish in that regard. And one of the things that I think is happening these days is we're moving from biological clans to patchwork family clan. We're piecing them together ourselves. Right. We're not relying solely on biological roots, and that's also a change that we need to think about. And what does that mean for us? Well, because when I look at my friends, they're not my family, but I consider them family. I treat them like family. Actually, sometimes I treat them better than my family, which isn't right. So,
well, and part of that, I think that we could kind of include what you're saying, but the way I look at it is, we have an understanding of, family, like Mark says, family and tribe are very important. But I think one of the things that has evolved with civilization is understanding family dynamics of how power was used in the family. And it could be used very controllingly, and it left impressions of misimpressions of how to use power. And I'm just saying the use of power begins in how your parents model it to you and what they did. And, we have a understanding of how children were sexually abused or beat. And so I think that's why I'm like you, I have an extended network of friends. But I think I'm glad you brought up listening, because I think it's a very important sense that's tied to this negative bias, a threat, because we can listen in a defensive way. Our defenses, when we listen, we're already defended. And we have to practice, in my opinion, to try to listen non-defensively which doesn't mean I have to agree with you. Like I was listening to you and your voice was going up. For me, I'm just a little sensitive that sometimes when it gets to a certain volume, I have to take a breath because that's my micromanaging being overwhelmed, you know. But this whole notion of learning how to listen non-defensively, I think it plays into what you're saying of the importance of listening, because I have this working theory, just tying it back for a moment to biology. We heard threat before we seen threat as we were evolving. The way I picture it, and on the savannah, there was a lot more about hearing a predator, not seeing, or sensing through hearing and other modes before you actually seen the predator upon you. So that's a very kind of, it takes it out, it grounds it in before the mental rational. You've pointed out it comes from here, the visual. It tends to be obsessed with the visual, and we need to bring back, like Marshall McLuhan talks about. I think we have to kind of recalibrate how we're using all our senses, not just one. We get really focused on one, which is usually visual, which in my experience is over mental rational, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense in as much as it's the language that we use tends to be visual. I see.
Yeah.
It's real simple for stuff like that. It's not like, I mean, you say, "I hear you, man. I hear you." Well, I don't know if we really hear them, or if we're just hearing what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And,
right.
So there's that. But this whole idea about listening. I was a language teacher for 8 years, and my daughter is still one now at university, and she tried to start a business based on language teaching, and there's 4 language skill areas that have to be taught, which is speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And 2 of them are considered active, and 2 of them are considered passive. Well, none of them are passive. They're all active. Mark, as a writer, will tell you it's an active thing. And when you're reading, I don't know. Look, Michael, you can hold up your book again. That's obviously not passive, just taking in words on the page. You say, and that's what we tend to do. I do that as well. I can't read. I'm a paper guy because I can't read without a pencil. And the thing that I miss the most about ebooks is that I can't highlight and annotate. They all just appear as a little number or a little thing that it's a link I have to click. I can't see my own machinations on the page with the writers.
Right.
So I feel separated, and I feel divorced at that moment. I like that togetherness that we have on the page kind of thing. Because I think reading and writing are very active. I think all language is active.
So it is possible. I do have the ebook, and I can take my tablet pen or pencil, and it's exactly like having the book at hand. But I can't throw it across the room when I get pissed off when Mark or else I'm going to be paying $500.
That is another important point, Doug. Very much so. Because you can highlight, and I like the fact that you can highlight in different. I'm a color guy. I always have 4 different colored pens around because I know things in different colors depending on what it is that I want to do or who I'm talking to.
And the mood you're in.
Most of the time it's me and how I'm talking to myself, okay? Or with the author or whatever, but I always have pencils and
I was going to say, that's why my dust jacket isn't there anymore. It's been across the room a few times. But.
Well, that's the thing. I think, I personally, I think every book needs to fly once, okay? There has to be something in every book that is provocative enough to go, not just no, but hell no, and then you go and pick it up and read it again so you start actually engaging. You see, but it's good.
Yeah.
I actually see, this is my idea of positivity. So hurl the book against the wall, going, how childish do you have to become, Ed? You're just reading a book. Like, okay, go, and we'll look at it again, and then you re-engage it. But to me, that's the fun of being able to engage a text. I don't think I don't just read. I like to engage. Just
Thank
like
you.
in a conversation, I like to engage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and what pisses me off, I guess, these days, it's harder and harder to engage people in a conversation, in an active, lively. Sorry, Michael, I come from an exceedingly loud family. The level people have commented just coming into the house here.
It's okay.
The decibel level here is like way above state norms that's allowed in public places or whatnot. Well, it's just home, you know.
Yeah.
We're just loud. We're just loud people.
Right.
So,
Well, and also, Ed, one of the things that pisses me off is everybody have their own rules of engagement. There's no standard, you know, and I learned this by being a bouncer at the coffee shop because I had my rules of engagement.
I can't get over a bouncer at a coffee shop.
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Well, hey, Mark,
it's an image to work with. I would like it's an image to work with.
Yeah, it is.
Mark, if I perceived anybody in the world that was that, I'd think of Michael.
But, you know, it has about people coming in and not paying their dues, you know, not paying and contributing. And it has to do with the striptease shows that we do.
Oh.
You know, so, you know.
There's caffeine in that coffee.
Now I get it.
You know, but, you know, my boss had one rules of engagement because he owns a place and he wants to, you know, he's concerned about customers. And then I have my own rules of dealing with the feet on the ground, of dealing with somebody in front of me that, you know, they're giving, you know, I'm trying to be respectful, but they're, you know, it's that engagement of, oh no, you've just moved from 1 strike to 3 strikes in a split second because you're just being a fucking idiot. And you got your hurt feelings because I'm telling you, and it's usually young men under the age of 25 that don't like to be told what to do, you know? And so, yeah, but you made a point, Ed, that I like, that I think we parallel is the only way we get to the point that we can really do what we're talking about is we actually have to go through it like we're doing it. And so many people have, because of various reasons I can understand, but I don't totally agree, they're avoiding teaching themselves how to work through differences and still be friends. I mean, I still have the issue with my sister. I know she's on that thing that, you know, we're not going to resolve our differences because she doesn't want to. And I finally am at a place of, that's okay. If that's the place you're going to be, that's the place you're going to be. You know, and I've taken initiative that I'm no longer going to go, I can meet her halfway, but I'm not going to go any further if that's the way you want to communicate with me. You know, but I really like what you said about, you know, the only way I've learned my skill to be able to not jump all over that person at the bus stop was from it's a cumulative experience from the coffee shop and me. I love this phrase. It's been my mantra ever since I kind of started healing from my trauma. Life begins at the edge of my comfort zone. And I only take that to mean that I'm not gonna imprison myself from feeling uncomfortable, because it's a residue from what I've taken metaphorically through my experience with my attempted suicide, is that there's a fine line in being safe and being in prison. And I imprisoned myself to the point that I decided I needed to take an action to resolve it. And fortunately, I failed. Because I wouldn't be talking to you guys right now. So yeah, there's this action. I mean, people need to, I just want to add another perspective and I'll shut up. One of the things that's come along in my training is the sensitivity of owning that. How do I receive Mark's words? How do I own the responsibility, the vulnerability in reading this book? And believe me, the first few chapters I read, I had a hard time. Trying to absorb it. It really, but because of the way I honor Mark, because I may disagree with him, but I like him. I wouldn't talk that straight myself, but I can appreciate somebody that does.
So I've got a couple of things to say, and I'll start with a review of the book, or my personal reaction from the book. And I don't get angry in that sense, and maybe the political or at another person just for expressing their point of view. And I really want to understand. And I think the book helped me to understand the other point of view, that I might be more central than most other people tend to pick or choose a side or whatnot. But I'm central not because I've thought about it deeply and this is where I need to be, but it's simply because I've been apolitical most of my life and I'm just entering the political scene. I tend to side with certain values, but at the same time, what do I know about the Trump supporter? Not much. Both my parents, I thought I knew, and they support Trump, and clearly I don't know them enough as to why. And I mean that in respect. I want to have conversations with them.
Right.
Just from growing up and who I am, it would seem like I would side with them, or they would reflect the values that I hold. So clearly I learned it somewhere else. But so your book was a preview into the mind of a Trump supporter. And you did say you supported Obama for certain reasons at the beginning. And you have a lot to say about that. We don't have to go into here. But I guess maybe I will go into it a little bit with the father figure or family structure, especially here in America. And we can say, based on stats, which I don't have in front of me right now, there's a very high percentage of single mother or single parent households, mostly single mothers. At one point on the site, I think that's how I kind of entered the site as an undercover agent in Kentucky, seeing angry males all around me, whether they were jobless or they lost their family. They were the statistic. They were no longer with their children, and they're angry about that, and they don't understand fully why. And that's a core, I would even, a root problem there, at least in contemporary society. And I don't know how this ties in, but I want to throw in Mr. Rogers. But my son does not like animated.
By the way.
Say that again? He's an expert? What'd you say, Ed? He went on mute there.
Mr. Rogers was from Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. That's right. I'm listening to his biography.
His neighborhood is where I grew up, except I didn't grow up there. Okay, not that.
But he based his show. I think I was saying my son does not like the animated. Daniel Tiger is a spinoff of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. There's Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which is the main little. This is supposed to be a puppet, not a quote mark, but the puppet Daniel Tiger, or Daniel, is a tiger, and they made an animated show based on this character to try to relate to children. But it's little animated figures running around. What Fred Rogers noticed when television was first coming out, this is from his biography written by Maxwell King, I think, is that there was nothing educational on TV. There was no discussion for children on TV going on, even if it was just the screen time there. And so he saw stupid people dressed up in suits throwing pies in each other's faces. I grew up beyond the time of these black and white TV shows or whatever they were, but it sounded like a lot of slapstick comedy. And he had very strong core Christian values, which I hold certain values of that, but he presented his values in a way that went beyond religion, I believe, went to the core of the issue. And he would, I checked out some DVDs at the library because I hadn't seen Mr. Rogers in years. And I didn't think my kid would want to watch it because it's such slow time thinking. But he connected with Mr. Rogers. He comes in with a song, enters his house, and won't you be my neighbor? And you're my friend. And he's making eye contact the whole time with the camera, talking directly to the viewer, which is intended to be the child, and having a direct conversation. And he could talk about a mechanical pencil for 30 minutes and have the entire room engrossed somehow, just simply by eye contact. The way the camera would zoom in on, like, okay, and this is the eraser. Did you know that the lead can come out of this hole here where the eraser is? And just the presentation, the slow time is not something that we witness on television or YouTube. You'll see a kid in a grocery store in a cart holding a tablet perhaps, because the damn kid won't sit still long enough for the parents to shop around the grocery store or something like that. I make sure my kid's pushing the cart around because that's what he wants to do. That's good parenting, according to me, because he's interacting with the world around him. But that's not available on TV. The child has, or the phone, the tablet. It's click on this YouTube video about monster trucks smashing cars or 10,000 other cartoons that are there. Mr. Rogers is available, and maybe some kids watch that, but this goes back to the complexity issue. Like, could we introduce something like Mr. Rogers on TV here? Could we have that discussion even with kids? And these kids grow up to be adults. Can we have a program that is slow time adult talking? Maybe on a PBS local show, they can sit down and have a discussion, but primetime TV and media, that's not really available, especially in America, in my opinion.
Well, try and hook this into the concept creep thing and community. And I address this, I think, in the chapter titled Community, is that, and I sense, Doug, that that's a very high value with you, is actually a physical community. And what here in America, and you experience it, Ed, you have a small community, everybody knows everybody, but here in America, the term community has been expanded into this thing, identity politics. Mm-hmm. The Black community, this community. And right. If you're in this community, you have to share the same ideology, the same beliefs, that, in other words, there are books written about where it started, and Nixon with the Southern strategy and all this, that if we can get these people, this block of people, to all vote this way, but at the root of all that is power. Mm-hmm. And in this, well, I think it's a universal phenomenon. power. And I speak to this in the preface, that what all this boils down to is who has power and who gets to decide what is what. And that boils down to basic resources, food, who has it, who gets to eat first, because that's who we are as human beings. Now, we can train some people, maybe all people, I don't know.
Maybe.
Can you train the mind to be something other than what we are? But then we fight about that. We fight about who we are and what, who gets to do this. And I make the point in this chapter, I think, on anger, that we're essentially, we're born dependent, but we're also born competitive and comparative, and we start competing and fighting for our parents' attention, for food. You take an infant and set him out in a field, see what happens. Just watch, see what happens. But you take an infant and put him in he's born into the world, and the first thing he does is she scream, and they get hungry, and they're trying to get their needs met, but a human infant cannot meet its needs
alone.
Well, for years and years and years.
Right.
So then you have this
Never.
interaction between the culture, the community, and the individual, which goes to previous Café. They're all linked, but on where does psychic conflict? What is the origin of that? What is the root of that? Well, it's the individual and the group,
right,
struggling for whatever. And now it's just exploded, and this is the concept creep, that community has been hijacked by politicians seeking power.
I agree.
And it's just in this country, and maybe everywhere. I mean, it's almost a good thing, Ed, in Germany, because there's this horrific example that I've heard of. I saw a piece on stumbling stones in Germany,
yeah,
where you're walking along and you stumble over a plaque where somebody was murdered by the Nazis, and that's a constant reminder of the horror that was Germany
yes,
at that time.
in the little village where I taught at the school. Just to pick up on that, not to interrupt you, keep your thought. But in that little village of 700 people, which is 5 kilometers down the road, there are 5 of those stumbling stones, the little brass plaques that have been set into the street in front of the house where that family lived, because there was one Jewish family in that village, and they were deported and gassed in Auschwitz. And it tells you when they lived there and where they lived, and they're called stumbling stones because you can't help but not see them. And it's a reminder. We need to remind ourselves of the things we don't get right, just as much as we have to remind ourselves of the things we do get right.
Right.
I think I think I do this in the preface, is that the Civil War was about these core principles and values and pride, all sorts of things, and the was it you, Doug, who talked about Charlottesville and the incident there? To some people, removing those statues is a crime because they remind them of, and it may be, we can have all kinds of opinions about right and wrong, and I know I make this point somewhere in the book, a soldier is a soldier. And it doesn't matter which side of the fight he's on. He aligns him, he, she, and now she align themselves with, they think they're on the right side of things. And they will fight. And to think that we can somehow make the world different, that we don't choose up sides, that's who we are, that's what we do. And it starts at birth. And to think that we've evolved past that, no, we can train ourselves, but that's still in there. And that's the problem with that, I think, is like Wilbur, Gebser, all these people, even Aurobindo and stuff, they don't understand biology and they don't understand how it works and how the life force is carried forward. And it's amoral.
But Mark, excuse me for interrupting. I must have been, I've read some of the books that you quote and stuff, but there's some biology to show that we're also need to be cooperative to get along.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And so what I struggled with in your book is not the maybe well-roundedness of that other side, the tension of those two instincts. I call them instincts. Even the instinct to get along, to be part of something, is an instinct. The instinct to protect it, and that's the tension. Is how do we hold that tension of those two, as you would say, and I think you do a good job of the contradictions that can come up. We have two contradicting instincts or tendencies in our very biology, but taking your point, I do feel that we haven't, I don't know the word for it, or I don't know, we haven't been more inclusive of both. We just want to pick sides of either one. It's either the instinct to protect and power over somebody, or it's the instinct to co-op and get along with the people. Well, no, it's a mix of both. I mean, I've gotten along better with my enemies sometimes than my fucking friends. And there's a reason for that, because at least with my enemies, we knew where we stood, and we had, and you used this word, there was more respect between me and my enemy than my friends sometimes.
It's just, and this is in the chapter, is the world a hostile, chaotic place, or is it not? If it were not, there wouldn't be all this hostility and chaos and struggle and all these biological ways to deal with a hostile environment. I think part of the problem is there is a wish that, oh, Mother Nature is nurturing. No.
Not all the time. Not all the time.
It never is. Again, take an infant and set it out in the field and see what happens to it. Mother Nature isn't going to take care of it.
I don't think you have to take an infant and set it out in the field. You can take any one of your neighbors and set them out in the field. And the same.
Well, and as an individual, we cannot survive.
No, we can't. And this is just to loop this back to I recognize this power issue has been around for a long time, and I recognize the biology, and I think it is in some instances underestimated or not fully considered. But by the same token, I don't think either one of them is absolute in any way, because it's not just that. It's not just biology, and it's not just power. It's a very complex complex of things. And this goes back to a point that I made earlier. I'm just going to reiterate it. When we are dealing with humans, whether we like it or not, we're dealing with a slightly different kind of evolution than we're dealing with pure biology, because we do have minds, yes, that are not strictly biological. We also live in bodies, for example, where there have been instances, for example, where people with incurable genetic diseases have cured themselves through whatever mental focusing.
Would that be the positive thinking, Ed?
No, it's not positive thinking. This there was a kid with elephantitis that cured himself because his mind actually changed his genetic structure to the point that this disease went away. Now, there are very rare events, and they're unusual events, and they are just simply considered anomalies by the people who said, well, the biology doesn't work that way. Well, it worked that way. You need to find out why. And so I don't want to say it's not that, it's this. What I'm trying to say is it's a bigger issue than any one of these individual factors. And what I give Gapser credit for is he acknowledges all of that biology very directly and says, and by the way, this other thing's going on at the same time, and we don't have a model to describe it. We don't have any way of actually trying to deal with it in some sensible manner. So now we have one. I think that's why I like them, because it's relatively simple. It's got 5 structures. It's a handful. You know, I can't handle much more than that. I don't have to juggle around charts and colors or whatever. But if I understand, I'm interrupting, but if I understood your paper that you wrote, Ed, which I really thought summarized it really well. Yeah, Gebser goes through the biological and the evolutionary, but then he just explains it as, well, then there's this leap, this mutant thing, and now we're over here. Well, yes and no. It's like when you say the environment out there is hostile. Hostile is a judgmental term.
Yes.
It just is as it is. I don't think that nature is cruel or hostile. It's nature. That we would, as individuals, or even as a community or as a group, have a lot of shit to deal with when we're in that. Okay. But to me, it's like I said, you are where you are, and that's where you are. And I think saying, oh, nature's hostile, you've already set up, not you in that sense, but that characterization of nature as hostile, which a lot of people do have, I think is misplaced, because, well, that's just how it is. Why don't you try to understand what it is? And then maybe you wouldn't think it's so hostile. You would just say, okay, harsh, it's still a judgmental term. Yeah, and I suffer when I'm there. Well, that's what Buddha was talking about. There's a lot of suffering in life, and not every bit of suffering that we have is of our own making. No. And that's the other part that people like to, pick up on and go, oh, well, you made your choices. Of course I have to live with the choices and the results of the choices that I make. But there are things in my life, in my environment, that I have zero influence on. Zero. And I don't consider myself victimized by those. I would just like to know what they are and recognize them and say, okay, now, because I have this thing up here and this thing in here, how do I want to deal with that? How do I want to approach that? How do I want who do I need to help me do that? You see, so I'm all back in this again. And even, to take a person who doesn't take this, let's say, spiritual leap. If you ever read Raymond Tallis, wrote a brilliant book. It's called Aping the Human, or Aping Humankind, or whatnot. And in there, as well as in the book that is called The Hand, he goes through to figure out how is it that human beings even got to the point where they had something that could be called, for lack of a better word, an evolution of consciousness and an evolution thereof, because it's not the same as it was 350,000 years ago. The consciousness, I believe that other species are also developing in these ways. Not as maybe as rapidly, because we got a head start on all of that, we as human beings, but there are what are the people who study gorillas and whatnot, where they've recognized that there are some simians who are not just using things in their environment. Any animal that has the capacity to grasp, like a great ape, can pick up a rock and break a nut, which the crow can't do, to use John's thing. But they, generally speaking, they use whatever available where they are, and they don't take them with them. They just use whatever there at the time. So you'll find the chimpanzee takes a stick and he can get termites out of the nest or whatever, but he doesn't take the stick with him. He doesn't refine the stick in any. He doesn't turn it into a tool. But there are some. What are these people called that study them? Anthropologists, I guess.
Yeah.
Who are recognizing that there are indications in these groups that they aren't just using what's there. They're starting to develop what we call use of tools, true use of tools. And that to me would say, okay, well, if that's the case, I don't know if it's the case. If that's the case, then that would indicate to me, analog to what I've read by Tallis or by Gapes or whomever, that there is some kind of change going on within the consciousness of this species. And so there may be such a thing. Jung talks, that's his whole idea of that. His theory of evolution goes from light to whatever and wherever. That's what that's all about. So it could be different than what we think. But it's not just biology. And biology, by no stretch of the imagination, explains this consciousness side of it. And we need to get that incorporated into it. And I would really like to see biologists engage that in a more serious manner than they have up until now.
Well, it is being done, and this is the new field. And we had a cafe about it, which I hosted, called Third Wave Existentialism, with the people being able now, scientists, to actually study the brain and what happens when, what sequence and what the chemical and biological, what's going on with consciousness. And so, yeah, but nobody agrees about anything in those fields.
That's correct. And I don't think that it's necessary to agree. I think it's necessary to converse.
Yes.
We have to be able to converse. We have to be able to get together. We have to get the people that said, there are people who go, it's just a chemical reaction in the brain, which may or may not explain anything or nothing. And there's other people over here who go, I'll take an extreme example, an Arbon, who goes, it's the spirit that's involved in blah, blah, blah. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But you've got to show me where the connection is, and you have to show me why that's not, in other words, there has to be more of a discussion going on. There has to be more of an engagement going on, and not this, what too often happens today in our present day and age is, well, you're just wrong and I'm right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't get us on.
Yeah, it's like, okay.
It is at base uncooperative, but we're cooperative creatures.
It's like the only way we can understand each other if we come to agreement. I've never experienced that agreement necessarily means you understand each other. I've actually understood people more by disagreeing with each other. An interesting book along this lines, Anthony DiMaggio wrote a book, A Strange Order of Things, which is an interesting, I think, conversation point of view of his understanding biology all the way down from the single cell and how from what he studied and how we created nervous systems, and from a single cell things began to evolve. And if I understand it right, the fact that we have nervous systems, and yes, we are in mammals, but we're a certain kind of mammal in that family, and we have a certain kind of nervous system that creates patterns in response to yes or no. Do I go closer? Do I evade? We store and we gather. We seem to gather information and remember, oh, I've been down this road before. I don't want to do that again. You know, and we create these patterns. Sometimes the difficulty is we don't question that just because it happened here doesn't mean it's the same thing, you know, down the road. So that's another kind of thing that I think human beings, and I personally feel that the Buddhist was a great biologist of understanding my interior nervous system and how it responded to the external environment. That's the way I take it, you know, as he very precisely understood, was paying attention to his interior and how he would respond to what was happening around him and interacting with people. And he came up with this thing, and I don't agree with everything, but I think it was a good first human tracking of our interior, of our ability to, it's like evolution mutated us, that we had this ability to separate and look at and stand back. But then, you know, so we could assess, like you said, Ed, and not make value judgment that this environment is necessarily hostile. It's just, this is the environment. How am I interacting with it? How is it interacting with me? Probably a better choice, you know. You know, I mean, as far as most of it is, we're reacting off of what's being thrown at us. But to bring some kind of mental capacity to actually separate, to learn, to kind of learn, or whatever you want to call it, to better engage the environment that, like you say, that we're in, or where we're at, you know. The thing with the self-reflective and mental reflection part, though, and you and I have had some conversations, is we forget we're the ones that's stepping back. We're still in the environment. Mentally, we think we've extricated ourselves and isolated ourselves from the environment. Not the case. Separating and seeing a difference isn't the same as, isn't isolating, unless you want to view it that way, like shutting the room and closing the doors when you're depressed and going to sleep, which I've done before.
I love to sleep, but I have a question for Mark. We're getting close to the top of the hour here, but what, I don't know how to phrase this so it doesn't sound silly. So, do we have hope?
Mm.
Do you think that we, you know, you've got a nice analysis of what's going on. Is there any hope for us? Or are we just going to have the civil war that you're?
Well, I think we're at a critical point. Towards the end of the book, I superimposed 3 different theories: Maslow's, with the Dunning-Kruger effect, with James Davis's theory of revolution. I think there's a potential for violence, and if we don't do this sort of thing that we're doing here in the cafe, and I didn't intend to write this book, and I didn't intend, you know, it's just something I do. I write, I think, and I write, and then I thought it might be useful to you know, put it out there, and then it took forever for reasons that I won't go into, but that are in the book. I guess my final analysis will be humans will survive. We won't extinct. But that doesn't mean there won't be a lot of misery and pain and suffering to get there. I don't think we've solved the problem of, and this the question I posed on the forum about the bane of humanity might be consciousness, because we think so much, we think ourselves into a tizzy, and we conjure up all these, problems. But there are problems. Eventually, there, and I say this in biological terms, the Earth has it not reached its carrying capacity as far as the human species. But nature has a way of solving that problem. So humanity will survive, but then it comes down to who,
or an
which
how.
group, which group.
Let me ask you just one question about that. If we have, in fact, if humans have this, if this consciousness is a biological product, then doesn't that say necessarily that it has survival value?
Absolutely.
Okay, then thinking ourselves into a tizzy isn't necessarily exercising survival value in a positive way, is it?
There's your paradox.
Okay, good. All right.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Hey, and Mark, I just want to say, with all things considered, I'm glad I bought your book and read it, because it just
Did you read the whole thing? You finished it?
Well, I'm about 2/3 of the way through.
And my hope is that people will, and the feedback I'm getting is it does provoke thought.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And I hope people can organize those thoughts and review it and put it out there, because I think the more people talking about these difficult, complex things, the better.
Yes. Yeah,
So
and
that's
I
my
agree.
hope.
I agree 100%, because it did provoke thought. It gave me more insight into, well, from my limited insight, more limited insight to you as a person and where you come from, and in terms of Trump and stuff.
Well, you're not done yet. You're not done yet. And just bless the people who can read it from beginning to end.
Yeah, and that is a skill that I'm going to have to practice, because there's certain people I wouldn't even give the book to. They don't have an open mind per se. But I have a few people that I think that would enjoy it, or at least be provoked.
And yeah, so read it to its conclusion, and yeah, take notes, do all that sort of stuff, and then hopefully it'll help bridge the great divide.
Yeah, actually, reading it has just deepened my willingness to. I don't have to agree with everybody, but can we have a conversation like we've been having the last 2 hours?
I think it'll come up in other conversations, and one of the proposals of the Cosmos Cafe is William Connolly's The Prelude from Facing the Planetary.
I have a lot to say about that.
So,
I read it.
Really?
I read it.
Imagine that.
But I thought that would be a good kind of bridge into where we left off here. And you do, in your book, you say a lot about environmentalism or just
Ecology.
concern for the environment. And I think in your own book, which I don't want to get into here since we're at the end of the hour, but there are conflicting views in your book with how we elect certain individuals and or the political and the environmental, I guess, would be the easiest way to phrase it. But yeah, I'm interested in where we go from the individual or the baby in the field of not knowing how to go out. So we're a group of 4 here, or more people tend to come on the cafe as well. But the discussions we have here, are they a bridge out of anger or a bridge out of like our predicament and being in the middle of nowhere and not knowing where to go? So I wouldn't mind
here's
seeing where we go.
We'll end it here. Here's my hope. The last cafe, Ed said he was planning to come to the USA the last time, and maybe we can actually put together a little conference retreat
Shindig.
built around Ed's last journey.
I think Marco and Caroline are.
It may be more
there's been
problematic
talk-
than you can begin to imagine.
There's been talk of everybody getting together at some point, so we
Wouldn't
can
that be
base it
great?
around.
Wouldn't that be
Ed's
great?
visit.
That would be great. And,
I think
and for that, Mark, I would be willing to make an exception to that hard and fast rule that I set for myself. All of my things are cast in concrete, but the concrete's never dry. So
Yeah, never dry. Never dry.
one thing I learned early in my life is never say never.
This has been
We'll
good,
see.
guys. This has been good.
Yeah, it was good.
Well, thank
Appreciate
you.
the work you did, Mark. I appreciate putting this together, and
Yeah.
I thought this was a really good chat.
Thank you all. I appreciate every single person who has the courage to open up this book.
Very
It's,
good.
it's a tough one. I admit it.
Oh yeah, it made my heart pitter patter.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Okay.
Take care of yourself. Take care of
Take
yourself.
care, man. Till the next time.
Yes.
Goodbye, everyone.